Medical workers will tell you that some cases stay with you forever. Some scenes are so devastating, so heartbreaking, that even the most experienced first responders break down. This is one of those cases. What you're about to hear is a story that shocked an entire city, brought veteran police officers to tears, and changed child protection laws across America. This is not just another true crime story. This is a wake-up call about how a system meant to protect the innocent can fail in the most catastrophic ways imaginable. Before we go any further, I need to warn you that this case involves a child, and the details are extremely disturbing. If you're not prepared for something truly heartbreaking, now is the time to click away. But if you stay, you need to hear this story, because understanding how this happened is the only way we can prevent it from happening again. November 23, 1995, Manhattan, New York. A 911 call comes in at exactly 9:24 in the morning from an apartment in the Rutgers Houses, a housing project on the Lower East Side. A neighbor's voice, shaking with panic and horror. A little girl, 6 years old, not breathing. The response is immediate. Police cars, fire trucks, ambulances, all converging on apartment 208. When firefighter Michael Brown arrives and enters that apartment, he's prepared for anything. He's seen it all in his years of service. Drug overdoses, violence, accidents. But nothing could have prepared him for what he found in that bedroom. A small body, a child, lifeless, and the injuries covering her tiny frame told a story that made grown men weep. Lieutenant Luis Gonzalez of the NYPD would later stand before cameras, his voice breaking, and say something he never thought he'd have to say in 22 years of service. He said, and I quote, "This is the worst case of child abuse I have ever seen. Think about that. 22 years in New York City, one of the toughest cities in America. And this was the worst he'd ever witnessed." The little girl's name was Elisa Izquierdo, and her story is one that New York would never forget. But here's what makes this case even more heartbreaking. Elisa wasn't just another child lost in the system. She had everything going for her. She was loved, protected, cherished. She had people fighting for her. She even had a prince, a real Greek prince, who wanted to save her. This should have been a fairy tale with a happy ending. Instead, it became a nightmare that exposed the darkest failures of the system designed to protect children. To understand how something this terrible could happen, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to when Elisa's story was filled with hope and love. February 11, 1989, Woodhull Hospital, Brooklyn. A baby girl is born, but she's not healthy. She's born addicted to crack cocaine because her mother, Awilda Lopez, had been using drugs throughout the pregnancy. Awilda was a troubled woman with a dark history. She'd been living in a homeless shelter after being evicted from her apartment, struggling with addiction, unable to care for herself, let alone a child. She already had 2 other children that she'd lost custody of because of her inability to provide a safe home. But there was another person in this story. Elisa's father, Gustavo Izquierdo. Gustavo was a Cuban immigrant who had come to America with dreams of becoming a dance teacher. He worked at the same homeless shelter where Awilda was staying, doing whatever jobs he could to make an honest living. When he found out Awilda was pregnant and still using drugs, he knew he had to protect his daughter. The relationship ended. And when Eliza was born with crack cocaine in her system, social workers immediately got involved. Given Awilda's addiction and instability, the decision was clear. Full custody was awarded to Gustavo. Now, Gustavo had no experience raising a child. He'd never changed a diaper, never prepared a bottle, but he was determined. He attended parenting classes. He asked friends and co-workers for advice. He learned quickly because he wanted to give his daughter the life he never had, and the people around him noticed. They saw how much he loved that little girl. Colleagues remember him calling at all hours, worried about teething, asking about fevers, wanting to do everything right. Elisa became the center of his entire world. Every morning, Gustavo would wake up early and iron a fresh dress for his princess. Yes, that's what he called her, his princess. He would carefully part her beautiful dark hair and braid it into perfect pigtails or braids. Teachers at her school would later say they'd never seen a father so devoted. He would send her to school looking like she'd stepped out of a magazine, always clean, always well-dressed, always loved. When Eliza turned 1, Gustavo enrolled her in the Montessori preschool at the YWCA in Brooklyn, and immediately, everyone fell in love with his little girl. Teachers described her as radiant, bright-eyed, full of life. She had this inner glow that just drew people to her. One teacher said she was beautiful, intelligent, and had enormous potential. Everyone who met her simply adored her. She was special, and everybody knew it. For her 4th birthday, Gustavo went all out. He rented an entire banquet hall in Queens just to celebrate her baptism in the Catholic Church. Chandeliers, decorations, the works. His friends would remember him saying over and over, "She's my life. She's my princess." He took her to the movies, to the circus. He bought her toys. Whatever she wanted, he tried his best to provide. He was creating the childhood he'd always dreamed of giving someone. But here's where the story takes an incredible turn. In 1990, Gustavo started falling behind on tuition payments at Elisa's school. Times were tough, but the school loved Elisa so much that they reached out to one of their patrons for help. That patron was Prince Michael of Greece. Yes, an actual member of Greek royalty. The prince would visit the school occasionally to support promising students. When he arrived one day in 1993, his staff introduced him to Elisa, and what happened next is the stuff of storybooks. The moment Elisa saw Prince Michael, she ran straight into his arms and stayed by his side for the rest of the day. The prince was completely taken with this bright, joyful little girl. He saw something special in her. He immediately offered to pay off Gustavo's debt, which was about $1,000, but he didn't stop there. He promised to pay for Elisa's entire private school education, all the way through 12th grade, at the prestigious Brooklyn Friends School. This wasn't just charity. Prince Michael genuinely cared about Elisa. He would send her gifts at Christmas, at Easter, sometimes just because, and Elisa, in her innocent, beautiful way, would send him thank you notes and drawings, little pictures of flowers, sunshine, happy families. The prince kept every single one. He saw in Elisa the potential to become anything she wanted. She talked about becoming a teacher someday, about helping other children. She was 6 years old, with a heart of gold and a future that looked brighter than anyone could imagine. But sometimes, life has other plans. In 1991, Awilda Lopez petitioned the court for unsupervised visits with Elisa. She claimed she'd turned her life around. She'd completed parenting classes through a federal program called Project Chance. She'd married a man named Carlos Lopez and had more children. She presented herself as reformed, stable, ready to be a mother. Social workers, seeing what looked like progress, recommended that the court grant her weekend visits with Elisa. And despite everything, despite the history, the court agreed. So Elisa started spending weekends with her mother. And almost immediately, people noticed changes. The bright, happy little girl who went to her mother's apartment on Friday would come back on Sunday a different child. She was withdrawn, quiet. Sometimes she'd wake up screaming in the middle of the night. She started having accidents, wetting the bed and losing control of her bowels. Even though she'd been toilet trained for years, she'd refuse to eat. She'd avoid bathrooms. And most alarming, she was coming back with bruises, visible injuries that no one could explain. Friends of Gustavo noticed discoloration on her arms, marks on her face. One neighbor reported seeing bruises on her genitals. Elisa, who used to be outgoing and friendly, now avoided other children. She'd started telling people at school that her mother locked her in closets, that Awilda hit her, that she didn't want to go back. She would literally say, "Awilda hits me. I don't want to go to Awilda." Gustavo immediately reported this to the authorities. The school principal reported it. Teachers reported it. This wasn't a secret. Everyone could see what was happening. In 1992, Gustavo petitioned the family court to end Awilda's visitation rights completely. He wanted his daughter back full-time, away from whatever was happening at her mother's apartment. But before the court could act on his petition, tragedy struck. Gustavo had been hiding something. He'd been diagnosed with cancer. By 1993, his health was rapidly declining. He knew he was dying. So he made a plan. He bought tickets to Cuba for himself and Elisa, scheduled for May 26, 1994. He was going to take her there, possibly leave her with family, where she'd be safe from Awilda, where she could grow up protected and loved. But Gustavo never made that flight. On May 26th, the same day those tickets were supposed to be used, Gustavo Izquierdo died. He was just 36 years old, and Elisa, his precious princess, was left alone in the world. Before we continue with what happens next, I want to ask you something. If you're watching this, you understand how important it is to speak up when children are in danger. These cases need to be heard. They need to be shared so we can learn from them. So if you haven't already, Please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, because we need to spread awareness about cases like this all over the world. The more people who know Elisa's story, the more likely we can prevent another tragedy like this from happening. Now let's continue with what happened after Gustavo's death, because this is where the system failed Elisa in the worst way possible. The moment Gustavo died, Awilda Lopez immediately filed for permanent custody of Elisa, and she didn't come to court alone. She brought an army, a lawyer from the Legal Aid Society, social workers who vouched for her. She had witnesses who said she'd turned her life around. On the other side, Gustavo's cousin, Elisa Canizares, challenged Awilda's petition. She filed for custody herself, arguing that Awilda was dangerous, unstable, and had a documented history of abusing Elisa. The school principal, Phyllis Bryce, wrote a detailed letter to the family court judge, Phoebe Greenbaum. In that letter, she laid out everything: the bruises, the behavioral changes, teachers' observation notes documenting the abuse. She literally wrote, Elisa was emotionally and physically abused during weekend visitations with her mum. Teachers' observation notes are available. Even Prince Michael of Greece wrote a personal letter to the judge, begging her not to give Elisa to Awilda. He offered to continue paying for her education. He offered financial support. He wanted to help, wanted to save this child he'd come to care about. But here's what happened in that courtroom. Elisa Canizares showed up alone. No lawyer, no support. Just a woman trying to save her cousin's daughter. Awilda Lopez showed up with legal representation, social workers, and a system that was supposed to reunify biological families at all costs. The judge, Phoebe Greenbaum, heard both sides. She had the letters. She had the warnings. She had documented proof that Elisa had been abused during those weekend visits. And in September 1994, she made her decision. Custody was awarded to Awilda Lopez. Elisa was going to live with her mother permanently. Everyone who loved Elisa was devastated. They'd done everything right. They'd reported the abuse. They'd documented everything. They'd fought through the legal system. And still, the judge chose to reunite the biological family. Later, when people asked Judge Greenbaum why she made that decision, she claimed she was just following procedural recommendations. But then Mayor Rudy Giuliani would say something that echoed what everyone was thinking. He said the judge makes the decision based on all the evidence. The judge had the power to protect Elisa, and she didn't. Within days of gaining custody, Awilda pulled Elisa out of her private school, Prince Michael's scholarship, who rejected, with the Brooklyn Friends School. Gone. Instead, Awilda enrolled Elisa in Manhattan's public school, 126, and immediately, the teachers there noticed something was terribly wrong. Elisa was no longer that radiant, bright-eyed little girl. She was withdrawn, emotionally disturbed, uncommunicative. She had to urinate constantly. The principal noticed she walked with difficulty, like every step hurt. She had bruises all over her body, and most disturbing, she'd started pulling out her own hair. Chunks of her beautiful dark hair, just gone. This was a child in crisis, and everyone could see it. In March 1995, someone sent an anonymous letter to the Manhattan Child Welfare Authorities. That letter stated that Awilda had cut off much of Elisa's hair, that she was locking her daughter in a dark room for hours, sometimes days at a time. The authorities received that letter. They read it, and they did ... nothing. No investigation. No follow-up. They claimed there wasn't enough evidence. Meanwhile, neighbors in Awilda's apartment building were hearing things that made their blood run cold. Screaming, crying, the sounds of a child being hurt. Mummy, mummy, please stop. No more, I'm sorry. Over and over, night after night. One neighbor would later say she heard noises that weren't normal. Banging, crying, then silence. And she felt helpless because she could hear it, but couldn't see it, so she didn't know what to do. Another neighbor reported the same thing. People knew something was wrong. They complained to authorities. But nobody did anything effective enough to save Elisa. What was happening behind those closed doors was beyond comprehension. Awilda Lopez, who'd gone back to using crack cocaine heavily, who'd become convinced that her daughter was possessed by the devil. Yes, you heard that right. She believed Elisa was evil, demonic, and needed to be punished. The details of what Awilda did to her own child are almost too horrific to speak aloud. But you need to know, because this is what happens when the system fails. Awilda would beat Elisa repeatedly with her fists, with objects, with anything she could grab. She forced the child to eat her own feces. She made her drink water mixed with ammonia. She would mop the floors using Elisa's head and hair, literally rubbing her daughter's face on the ground. She inflicted burns on Elisa's head, face, lips, and body. She sexually assaulted her own daughter with hairbrushes and toothbrushes. She would hang Elisa from the shower rod for entertainment, leaving her there while she laughed. When Elisa's stepfather, Carlos Lopez, came home, he would join in. He encouraged Awilda's other children to hit Elisa. He smashed her head against concrete walls. He dropped furniture on her, crushing her finger and toe. And through all of this, Elisa had no escape. No one came to save her. On November 15, 1995, Carlos Lopez was arrested for a parole violation and sent to jail. For 1 week, Elisa was alone with her mother. 7 days that would be the longest and most painful of her short life. On November 22, 1995, the day before Thanksgiving, Awilda Lopez did something that would finally end Elisa's suffering in the most tragic way possible. In a fit of rage, believing her daughter was possessed, Awilda grabbed Elisa and threw her head first into a concrete wall, multiple times, with all his strength. The impact was so severe that blood vessels burst in Elisa's brain. A massive hemorrhage began. Elisa collapsed. She stopped moving, stopped responding. Fluid began leaking from her nose and mouth. Brain fluid. That evening Awilda called her sister, Mercy Torres. She told her that Elisa was lying on the bed like retarded. Her words, that liquid was coming out of her nose and mouth, that the child wouldn't eat or drink. Mercy, horrified, begged Awilda to take Elisa to the hospital immediately, and Awilda said she would think about it after she finished washing the dishes. Think about that. Her daughter is dying, and she needs to finish the dishes first. Awilda never called 911. She never took Elisa to a hospital. She left her daughter lying in that bed, dying slowly, all through the night. The next morning, November 23rd, Awilda invited a neighbor into her apartment to look at Elisa. When the neighbor saw the child's lifeless body, he immediately realized she was gone. He begged Awilda to call the police. She refused. For 2 hours, he pleaded with her. Finally, he made the call himself. That's when the first responders arrived. That's when firefighter Michael Brown found Elisa. That's when seasoned police officers broke down and cried at what they saw. Lieutenant Luis Gonzalez would later describe finding deep red marks, burns covering her entire body, an enormous bruise near her kidney, bruises on her face and temples, ghastly wounds around her genitals. The bone of her right pinky was sticking through the skin, and underneath all of that, the autopsy would reveal broken bones that had healed wrong, internal organ damage, extensive scarring. This was a child who had been systematically tortured for over a year. When the medical examiner completed the autopsy, the findings were clear. Elisa died from a brain hemorrhage caused by blunt force trauma to her head. But the examination revealed something else. Years of abuse, months of starvation, prolonged torture. The worst case of child abuse they had ever documented. Awilda Lopez was arrested immediately. When they took her into custody, she tried to claim she didn't do it. She tried to blame Carlos. But eventually, she confessed. She admitted throwing Elisa against the wall, admitted that the child never moved again, admitted leaving her daughter to die rather than getting help. The city of New York erupted in outrage. How could this happen? How could a child who was so loved, so protected, so visible in the system, end up dead? The Child Welfare Administration had been notified at least 8 times, 8 documented times, about concerns for Elisa's safety. 8 times, and they did nothing effective. Teachers reported abuse. The school principal reported abuse. Neighbors called. Family members called. An anonymous letter was sent, and every single time, the system failed to act. The Daily News published a front-page editorial that captured the city's rage. It read, "Elisa Izquierdo is finally at peace. May her mother never find a moment of it again. She will get doctors, medication, lawyers, innocent until proven guilty. Damn her." Time magazine put Elisa on their cover on December 11, 1995. With the headline, "A Shameful Death." The article asked the question that everyone in America was asking: how does a child fall through this many cracks? How does someone with a documented history of abuse, with ongoing complaints, with visible injuries, get full custody of a child? Elisa's funeral was held on November 29, 1995. 300 mourners attended, including relatives, neighbors, teachers, politicians, and Prince Michael of Greece. Elisa's casket remained open. Even with funeral cosmetology to cover the damage, people could still see bruises on her face. She wore a crown of white flowers on her head. A single red rose was placed in her small hand. Her coffin was draped with white flowers, and mourners filled it with toys, stuffed animals, and notes. A Barbie doll that Gustavo had given her, which she'd cherished, was placed beside her. At the funeral, Reverend Gianni Agostinelli spoke words that cut to the heart of what happened. He said Elisa was killed not only by the hand of a sick individual, but by the silence of many, by the neglect of child welfare institutions, and by the moral mediocrity that has intoxicated our neighborhoods. She was failed by everyone. Every adult who was supposed to protect her. Every system designed to keep children safe. They all failed. Elisa was buried at Cypress Hills Cemetery in Queens. Her gravestone bears an inscription that serves as both a memorial and a warning. It reads, "World, please watch over the children." Even in death, Elisa didn't find peace in the way she should have. Despite everything Awilda had done, despite murdering her own daughter, she was granted rights to Elisa's remains. So even in death, Elisa never got to be reunited with her father, the man who loved her more than anything in the world. On June 25, 1996, Awilda Lopez pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. During the sentencing, she broke down crying in court, but Judge Alvin Schlesinger showed no sympathy. Before sentencing, he openly criticized the entire child welfare system. He said, "We have not created procedures to do everything necessary to protect the young and vulnerable in this society. This system has failed to protect our babies, and don't tell me how much it costs. If anything good comes from this horrendous tragedy, it will be that we give priority to these babies." Carlos Lopez, the stepfather, was also sentenced to prison for his role in abusing Elisa, including an incident where he repeatedly banged her head against a concrete wall just weeks before her death. But here's something that will make your blood boil. Awilda Lopez became eligible for parole in 2010. She was denied. But in April 2022, after serving just 26 years, Awilda Lopez was released from prison. She's free, walking the streets, while Elisa remains buried in that cemetery, with her plea to the world to watch over the children. That's our justice system. But Elisa's death did create change. Real, lasting change. In February 1996, just months after her death, New York Governor George Pataki signed Elisa's law into legislation. This law completely reformed the child welfare system in New York. It lifted the veil of confidentiality that had been protecting agencies from accountability. Before Elisa's law, when a child died from abuse, child welfare agencies could hide behind confidentiality laws. They didn't have to reveal how many complaints they'd received. They didn't have to explain what steps they took or didn't take. Mistakes could be swept under the rug. Not anymore. Elisa's law requires full transparency. When a child dies from abuse or neglect, the public has the right to know everything. Every complaint that was filed, every report that was made, every action or inaction by the agency. The law holds child welfare workers publicly accountable. It forces agencies to explain their decisions. It creates a public record so that when mistakes are made, they can be identified and corrected. In January 1996, Mayor Rudy Giuliani created the Administration for Children's Services, a completely new agency dedicated solely to child welfare, reporting directly to the mayor. It was the first time in New York City's history that child protection had its own independent agency. The city also reviewed 400 cases across the system and found that employees had violated procedures in 78% of them. 78%. The entire system was broken, and Elisa's death forced them to acknowledge it and fix it. Dozens of reforms followed. Better training for caseworkers, lower caseloads, more frequent home visits, stricter guidelines for custody decisions, greater coordination between schools, law enforcement, and child services. Mandatory reporting became stronger. The standard for evidence in abuse cases was clarified. All because of Elisa. But here's the thing. Despite all these reforms, despite Elisa's law, despite the promises that this would never happen again, children are still dying. Every single year in America, hundreds of children die from abuse and neglect. Many of them were known to Child Protective Services. Many had reports filed on their behalf. The system is better than it was in 1995, but it's far from perfect. And that's why cases like Elisa's, need to be told, not to shock you, not for entertainment, but because awareness is the first step toward prevention. When we know the warning signs, when we understand how the system works and where it fails, we become better at protecting children. So what can you do? What should you look for? Children who are being abused often show changes in behavior. They become withdrawn or overly aggressive. They have unexplained injuries or frequent accidents. They're afraid of certain people or places. They have developmental delays or regress in skills they'd already learned, like toilet training. They flinch when touched. They're always hungry or seem neglected. They talk about hurting themselves or show knowledge of sexual behavior inappropriate for their age. If you see these signs, you have a responsibility. Call your local child protective services. Call the police. Call the school counselor. Make the report. Yes, it might be uncomfortable. Yes, you might worry you're overreacting. But better to make a call that turns out to be nothing than to stay silent while a child suffers. Elisa's neighbors heard her screaming. They heard the abuse happening through the walls, but they didn't know what to do. They felt helpless. Don't be that person. If you hear something, if you see something, act. Call 911. Insist that someone investigates. Follow up if nothing happens. Be relentless. Because somewhere out there, there's another Elisa, another child trapped in a nightmare, praying that someone will notice, someone will care enough to save them, and that someone might need to be you. Prince Michael of Greece and his wife were so devastated by what happened to Elisa that in 2008, they founded the Elisa Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children in Greece. They dedicated their lives to protecting children in Elisa's honor, using their resources and platform to raise awareness and prevent abuse. That's the kind of legacy Elisa deserves. Not just laws and agencies, but people who care, who act, who refuse to let children suffer in silence. This case changed New York forever. It exposed how broken the system was. It showed that even when everyone does what they're supposed to, reports the abuse, documents the injuries, fights in court, the system can still fail. Judge Greenbaum had all the evidence. She had letters from teachers, from a prince, from family members. She knew about the abuse, and she still chose to give Elisa to a wilder because the policy at the time was to reunify biological families at all costs. Even when that cost was a child's life. That policy has changed, but it took Elisa's death to change it. How many children had to die before someone said enough is enough? How many more will die before we perfect a system that's still failing kids today? These are the questions we need to keep asking. Elisa Izquierdo was born with crack cocaine in her system, but she fought through it. She was smart, beautiful, kind, full of potential. She had a father who loved her unconditionally. She had teachers who saw her brilliance. She had a prince who wanted to give her the world. She should have become anything she wanted. A teacher, a dancer, a mother herself one day. Instead, she died at 6 years old, tortured and alone, in the very place that was supposed to be her home. Her last words, heard by neighbors through thin walls, were "Mummy, Mummy, please stop. No more, I'm sorry." She died, apologizing for existing, trying to appease the person who was supposed to protect her above all others. If this story breaks your heart, good, it should. If it makes you angry, even better. Channel that anger into action. Share this video. Spread Elisa's story. Make sure people know what happened and why it matters. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more cases like this. Cases that need to be told so we can learn from them and prevent future tragedies. Leave a comment telling me where you're rewatching from and what you think needs to change in the child welfare system. Let's create a conversation. Let's keep Elisa's memory alive, not through sadness, but through action and awareness, because that's what she deserves. New York was forever changed by Elisa Izquierdo. Laws were written in her name. Agencies were restructured because of her death. Her story became a rallying cry for child protection across America. The little girl who loved to dance, who drew pictures of sunshine and flowers for a prince, who dreamed of becoming a teacher, became the symbol of why we must never, ever stop fighting for children who can't fight for themselves. Rest in peace, Elisa. The world heard your story. The world learned from your suffering. And we promise to keep watching over the children, just like your gravestone asks us to, because you deserved so much better, and we failed you. But we won't forget. We won't let your death be in vain. Thank you for watching. This is one of the hardest cases I've ever covered, but it's one of the most important. Please, take this story with you. Remember, Eliza, and if you ever find yourself in a position to help a child in danger, don't hesitate. Be the person Eliza needed. Be the voice she didn't have. Until next time, stay aware, stay vigilant, and always, always protect the children.